The lights were red. The siren was real, but one man did not move. September 26, 1983, a classified underground bunker near Moscow, lined with consoles, blinking screens, and sealed steel doors. The time, 0040. Suddenly, a klaxon screamed, a panel lit up, launch detected, United States. Inside the Serpukhov 15 command center. Men jumped from their stations. Protocol was immediate verify, confirm, escalate, above them, in a shielded array of orbiting satellites. A Soviet early warning system known as OKO had just detected a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile launch from a silo in Montana. Colonel Stanislav Petrov stared at the screen. One missile. 30 seconds later, it became 5. The room froze. These were not drills. These were not exercises. The system confirmed inbound nuclear attack. 5 American ICBMs, streaking toward Soviet soil, with an estimated time to impact under 25 minutes. A single key press would begin the Soviet retaliation protocol. And yet Petrov did nothing. He didn't call the general staff. He didn't lift the red phone. Behind him, officers shouted. "We have confirmation," one cried. "We must report this up the chain." But he stayed seated, eyes locked on the screen. Something was wrong. No launch signatures from U.S. radar. No visual confirmation from ground-based telescopes. Just a satellite ping. A silent algorithm screaming Armageddon. And then came the automated demand escalate to second strike. Had Petrov obeyed, the system would have alerted Soviet strategic rocket forces. ICBMs would leave their silos in Siberia, targeted at Washington, New York, and NATO command centers. Thousands would die in minutes. But he didn't obey. He waited. He watched the clock. He broke the protocol. And Moscow panicked. Because no one, not the KGB, not the Defense Ministry, not the Missile Command could understand why the duty officer in charge of nuclear launch detection refused to press the button. Not knowing that in doing nothing, he may have saved the world. They had 8 minutes to decide. One man did nothing. And the Soviet Union descended into chaos. The bunker was built for certainty, 6 levels underground, beneath reinforced concrete and electromagnetic shielding, sat the Soviet Union's most sacred military trust, the OKO early warning system, a constellation of satellites linked to ground-based radars and command algorithms, all designed with one purpose: detect American nuclear launches and ensure retaliation before the first warhead touched Soviet soil. Inside that system, human instinct was not part of the plan. The doctrine was simple. Any confirmed missile launch from the United States was to be assumed hostile. There was no allowance for error, hesitation, or doubt. The Cold War had engineered paranoia into policy. If the system saw something, it was real. And if it was real, it had to be answered with fire. OKO's designers had assured the general staff false alarms were impossible. The algorithm analyzed launch heat signatures, satellite trajectories, sun angles, and surface reflectivity. It could distinguish a missile from a plane, a flare, or a glitch. "There will be no confusion," said the engineer-in-chief. "Only reaction." In the command rooms of the strategic rocket forces, this belief ran deep. Confidence wasn't optional. Redundancy was everything. If a system failed, another took over. If doubt emerged, it was crushed by layers of automation. Human error had been engineered out, at least. That's what they believed. When OKO was activated that night, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It saw a launch, then another, then 3 more. At 0042, the control room at Serpukhov 15 received the cascade of warnings. 5 launches, confirmed trajectory, origin United States, target Soviet heartland. The men in the room didn't question it. They stood as trained, awaiting the chain of command escalation. Phones were picked up. Launch codes were prepared. The response was automatic. But one man, Colonel Petrov, hesitated. He had read every manual, memorized every protocol. He knew what was expected. And still, he doubted. Behind him, a major whispered, "This is it. The end." Another tried to call the general staff, but was blocked. The officer in charge hadn't given the go-ahead. Confusion turned to anger. Why aren't we escalating? The Americans launched first, but Petrov didn't believe it. Because deep down, behind the layers of programming and theory, he sensed something no machine could calculate. It didn't feel right. 5 missiles. If the Americans wanted war, it wouldn't be 5. It would be hundreds. But no one in that room had trained for instinct, only for confirmation. The bunker that had been designed to eliminate human error now depended entirely on it. And that was their first blind spot. The Soviet nuclear doctrine was not designed for flexibility. It was built around speed, certainty, elimination of doubt. From the moment of a confirmed American launch, the Soviet Union expected to have no more than 15 to 20 minutes before impact. That was the window not just for analysis, but for decision, escalation, and retaliation. There would be no second chance, and so the doctrine was simple: detect, confirm, respond. The entire system, from the satellite constellation to the nuclear command bunkers, existed to execute that sequence flawlessly and without hesitation. It wasn't just policy, it was a philosophy. The United States, in Soviet eyes, was always preparing for a first strike. Their nuclear submarines, their Minuteman silos, their global radar arrays. Washington would launch first decapitating Soviet leadership in minutes, and then sue for peace from a position of strength. To prevent that, Moscow relied on launch on warning, not launch after confirmation, not launch after impact, but launch based on the first credible signal before the enemy's warheads ever arrived. This concept demanded that the early warning system, once triggered, be trusted absolutely. That trust, in turn, was enshrined in procedure. Duty officers had no authority to delay, no mechanism for override. The algorithm was to be believed. Escalation was to be immediate. Human emotion had no place. As one internal briefing stated, man is the weak link. Remove him from decision where possible. And yet, on the night of September 26, 1983, the weak link was all that stood between peace and nuclear war. Because when the alarm blared and the system declared high confidence, protocol required that Colonel Stanislav Petrov escalate the warning up the chain, triggering preparations for Soviet missile retaliation. He didn't. He broke doctrine. By doing nothing, he violated the very heart of Soviet nuclear policy. This wasn't just disobedience. It was ideological rupture. A system built to operate without reflection had been stalled by one man's hesitation. And that hesitation unraveled the illusion of perfection. Because for the first time in the history of the Cold War, the question wasn't about weapons or numbers or codes. It was about trust in a machine. And for 8 minutes, the entire doctrine of mutual destruction hung on one man choosing not to follow the plan. It came in silence, no shockwave, no flash, just a sequence of numbers and a blinking word: launch. At 004001, the Oko satellite system relayed a launch detection signal to Serpukhov 15. The alert showed a single missile rising from a known American ICBM silo field in Montana. Its trajectory arcing northeast matched previous simulations of a nuclear first strike. Colonel Petrov stood motionless. His training told him that this was it, the final moment every Soviet officer had drilled for but hoped never to see. Seconds later, the system adjusted. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4. By 004102 it read, 5 simultaneous launches, exactly the kind of limited decapitation strike American war planners theorized could disable Soviet command and control before a full exchange. Petrov didn't move. His subordinates were already shouting, preparing escalation logs, demanding confirmation orders. But he saw something they didn't. Not with his eyes, those only showed red lights and flickering text. What he saw was wrongness. 5 missiles. Why only 5? The United States had thousands. If war had truly begun, why such a small number? A decoy, a system error. He scanned for radar corroboration. None. Ground-based arrays showed no incoming objects, no atmospheric distortion. Only the satellite data screamed war. It didn't add up. The Oko system was new, still unproven, just months earlier. Petrov had been briefed on its architecture, how the geostationary satellites could be blinded by solar reflections off cloud tops during equinox. Now he watched as those very conditions aligned. Sunlight, atmospheric scatter, high-altitude clouds over North America. A perfect storm for a false positive. But no one else in the room saw it that way. The timer on the console ticked down. 5 minutes to decision. Protocol required escalation. The command line sat open. Just one word confirmed and the process would begin. Petrov sat in a chair designed to launch Armageddon and said nothing. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He reviewed the launch trajectory again. Still 5 missiles. Still no secondary confirmation. Still no radar trace. Still silence. The system insisted it was real. His instincts screamed it was not. And then, like a power switch, flicking off the screen changed. No launch detected. The warning vanished. The system reset. The Phantom missiles never reached the halfway point. They were never there. Petrov exhaled. Slowly. He had done nothing, and in doing so, Xianun had prevented everything. His officers, confused and pale, looked around. Some were furious. Others were afraid. But none of them could change the fact that the world was still intact. The impossible had just occurred. The system had lied, and only one man had refused to believe it. This should not have been possible. When the alarm ended and the red lights went dark, the room didn't relax. It froze. The officers at Serpukhov 15 stared at Colonel Petrov, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. He hadn't escalated. He hadn't called the general staff. He had ignored a confirmed nuclear launch warning. Protocol wasn't just broken, it had been erased. Within the hour, reports were filed, not about the false alarm, but about him. Why hadn't he reacted? Why had he delayed when the system had demanded action? The initial review from higher command was blunt. Dereliction of duty under wartime simulation. But this wasn't a simulation. The system had given no indication that it was a drill, and yet Petrov had sat still, watching 5 phantom warheads that never existed, and chose not to believe them. In the KGB's signals division, the response was disbelief bordering on outrage. They had invested billions into the Oko satellite network. It was advertised as flawless, immune to weather, angle, and error. It was supposed to eliminate ambiguity, to give Moscow the confidence to strike back before the first American missile landed. And now, the whole concept had been undermined by a single officer who refused to do what the machine said. Behind closed doors, a new theory circulated. The fault wasn't the system, it was Petrov. Perhaps he had misunderstood the alert. Perhaps he had panicked. Perhaps he was a sympathizer. Suspicion, not gratitude, filled the corridors of power. His commanders reviewed every log, every word spoken during those 10 minutes. They interrogated his shift partners. They reanalyzed satellite telemetry, hunting for noise, distortions, anything that could prove Petrov wrong, but they found nothing, or rather, they found too much. The false alarm, it turned out, had come from a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds directly into the satellite sensors, a known vulnerability buried in technical documentation, but dismissed as improbable. It had happened. It had triggered the alarm, and had Petrov followed protocol, Soviet nuclear forces would have launched before the error could be discovered. But none of that was publicly admitted. There was no apology, no commendation, just a quiet directive: do not discuss this incident, ever. The KGB closed the file. The Ministry of Defense reclassified the event, and Petrov was reassigned to a non-operational post, then quietly retired. No medals, no ceremony, no thanks. In the official record, the system had worked, but in the private halls of military command, a cold realization crept. In the most advanced early warning network in the Soviet arsenal, had failed its first real test, and only human hesitation had prevented a thermonuclear war. That truth was too dangerous to speak aloud, so instead, they pretended it never happened. They filed it under anomaly. They treated Petrov not as a savior, but as a variable, an outlier, something to be controlled or ignored. Because if one man's instinct could override a $2 billion system, then the system was never really in control. They couldn't accept the truth. So they wrote a lie. In the days that followed the false alarm, high-level briefings circulated across the Soviet General Staff, each one reinforcing a singular conclusion: the Americans were testing Soviet reaction time. Not a glitch, not sunlight, not a system error, a provocation, a feint, a strategic test of Soviet nerve under conditions of partial visibility. The theory came from inside the strategic missile forces, drafted by analysts unwilling to believe their billion-ruble satellite network had been fooled by a cloud. According to the report, the United States had deliberately launched a controlled heat event, possibly from a submarine or high-altitude aircraft, designed to simulate an ICBM trajectory, without triggering actual war. The goal: measure Soviet response, probe reaction time, map the chain of command under duress. The term probing launch began to circulate. KGB field stations in Cuba, East Germany, and the Pacific were tasked with retroactively analyzing telemetry, radio chatter, and electromagnetic anomalies. Intelligence chiefs wanted proof. Proof that what had happened wasn't weakness, but an act of foreign deception. And yet, no such proof was found. There were no launch echoes from U.S. missile fields, no ignition trails, no infrared spikes, no airborne events matching the timing or trajectory logged by the OCO satellites. The Americans had launched nothing. Still, the Soviet explanation hardened. In briefings, it became doctrine. The incident was not a technical fault, but a signal Washington had experimented with a disarming first-strike simulation. The logic was circular. We must assume they intended it, one air defense official stated, because to assume it was an accident would imply we could be fooled again. They needed the lie more than they needed the truth. Accepting that the system failed meant rewriting years of strategic planning. It meant admitting that the cornerstone of Soviet nuclear deterrence launch on warning rested on a network that could hallucinate Armageddon. The wrong theory became insulation. It preserved confidence in the machine, the procedure, the deterrent. It placed the blame not on Soviet engineering, but on American trickery. It turned Petrov's hesitation from dangerous disobedience into justified caution. But quietly, in side conversations and closed-door sessions, Senior officers whispered what they couldn't put into writing. What if it happens again? They didn't have an answer. So instead, they lied to themselves, because it was easier to believe in a clever enemy than to confront the horror of a blind system. When the probing launch story began to unravel, panic didn't disappear, it evolved. A new explanation emerged from a different corner of the Soviet security apparatus. This one didn't blame the Americans at all. It blamed their own people. Within the KGB's 9th Directorate, whispers grew that the incident may have been sabotage, not by a foreign hand, but from inside. The OCO system was highly compartmentalized data processing in one chain. Command verification in another. It was possible, they argued, that a traitor embedded in the telemetry division had tampered with the signal conversion protocols, or worse, manipulated raw satellite data to trigger a false alarm. The theory gained traction among hardliners. The narrative had appealed the West wasn't probing Soviet defenses, they were infecting them. Information warfare, before the term existed, a well-placed mole, perhaps even in the design bureau that built the satellite processors, could have seeded the flaw years earlier. A full counterintelligence operation was launched. Officers were interrogated. Security clearances were reviewed. Archives were scoured for anomalies in data streams or communications during the false alarm window. The logs showed nothing. The engineers insisted nothing could have been inserted without detection. But the political momentum had shifted, not toward truth, but toward control. The idea that human sabotage, not solar glare, had nearly sparked a nuclear exchange gave the Kremlin a target, someone to blame, someone to hunt. It justified tighter surveillance on military engineers. It expanded the authority of the KGB within the strategic rocket forces. And it reassured the leadership that the machine hadn't failed. A man had. But behind closed doors, some officials pushed an even darker angle. What if the system had performed as designed, and what failed was the man who ignored it? They re-examined Petrov's past, his education, his loyalty record, his political reliability. A classified psychological profile labeled him analytical but independent, a euphemism for unpredictable. Not the trait you want in the man who decides the fate of nations in 8 minutes. It became a dangerous question if Petrov had escalated the alarm. No one would have questioned him, but because he didn't, his loyalty was questioned. The system had created a paradox. Its rules demanded obedience, but the only reason disaster was averted was because someone broke those rules. So they tried to rewrite the rules instead. In the months that followed, new protocols were drafted to reduce individual discretion. In future alarms, more automation, more authority centralized in collective committees, less room for hesitation. They weren't trying to solve the real problem. They were trying to solve a problem that didn't exist. By the time the final investigation was closed, the Soviet intelligence community had already failed in 3 directions. First, they failed to predict the failure. The KGB and GRU had both signed off on the deployment of the OCO system. They had verified its protocols, reviewed its threat matrices, and declared its algorithms sound. When questioned after the event, senior KGB technical officers could not explain why the system had interpreted sunlight as missile launches, because they had never considered the possibility. Second, they failed to detect anything in real time. No GRU station picked up anomalous signals from U.S. missile sites. No electronic surveillance flagged elevated DEFCON levels in American forces. No human source, despite years of deep cover assets, reported a pending launch, a drill, or even suspicious movement. On that night, The entire Soviet intelligence network was blind. Not a single report could support or refute the satellite alert. The system had screamed attack, and the rest of the machine had answered with silence. Third, they failed to respond with clarity. Instead of admitting the vulnerability, the intelligence branches turned inward. They doubted Petrov, doubted each other, doubted the very data they were built to trust, and in their confusion, they created narratives that further diluted the truth. A classified GRU analysis later admitted that the system had been tested only under controlled conditions. The OCO satellites had never operated during a solar equinox over the northern hemisphere, while simultaneously observing reflective cloud banks over the U.S. Midwest. It was a perfect storm, literally. An optical illusion amplified by orbital geometry and sunlight scatter. In any other season, it might not have happened, but it did, and they were unprepared. The postmortem concluded that had Petrov escalated the signal as instructed, the Soviet strategic rocket forces would have entered high alert, preparing retaliatory launch packages within minutes. With communications compressed and under wartime pressure, the General Staff may have issued a limited counterstrike order based entirely on a phantom. The fact that Petrov hesitated wasn't proof of Soviet brilliance. It was proof of luck, and that terrified them, because their system had been built on the belief that technology could replace doubt, that structured verification, multiple data points, and centralized control would remove the chaos of human decision. But on the only night it mattered, none of those safeguards worked. The Americans hadn't launched, they hadn't provoked, they hadn't even known. And yet the Soviet Union had come within minutes of launching the end of the world because their eyes had seen a shadow and believed it. In the end, the GRU buried the report, and the system kept running. There had been no launch. No American ICBM had left its silo in Montana. No stealth bomber had taken off. No submarine had fired its payload. What the Soviet system had interpreted as a nuclear first strike was, in reality, a trick of light sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds above the central United States during the autumn equinox, bouncing directly into the lens of a Soviet satellite. And yet, it was enough to almost end the world, because the American system didn't have to do anything. Its greatest strength in that moment was silence. Unlike the Soviets, the U.S. had never fully embraced launch on warning as a first-strike doctrine. Their warfighting logic leaned toward survivability, ensuring that enough nuclear capability would survive a first blow to retaliate later. It was a philosophy built on hardened silos, roaming submarines, and command redundancy, not reaction time. This difference in posture mattered, while the Soviets built systems that demanded instant reaction to avoid decapitation. The Americans had quietly optimized for endurance. Their missiles were not only dispersed, but deliberately hardened. Their warning systems integrated radar, infrared, and signal intercepts into a fusion architecture that required multiple points of confirmation. A single alert would never trigger a launch. It would trigger questions. And on the night of September 26th of 1983, the Americans never knew how close things had come. Because the U.S. didn't launch, not a single command was issued. No alerts were raised, no status changes observed by Soviet reconnaissance. The system that triggered Soviet panic was acting entirely on Soviet inputs, on internal sensors, internal logic, internal shadows. In fact, as later documents would show, U.S. satellite launches during that period had been minimal. There were no major exercises scheduled, no ICBM drills, no high-level war games. The Strategic Air Command was operating under normal posture, but the Soviet system didn't need a real launch. It just needed the shape of one. And the Americans had built their posture to exploit that vulnerability, not by design, but by patience, by restraint. Where Soviet planners feared a knife in the dark, American doctrine preferred to hide in the fog, uncertain. Yes, but survivable. Ironically, the very thing that made the use system effective, its refusal to overreact, was the opposite of what nearly brought Soviet missiles to launch. Petrov understood this intuitively. 5 missiles, launched in isolation, made no strategic sense. They wouldn't decapitate Soviet command. They wouldn't cripple a second strike capability. They were too few, too clean. It felt like an echo, not an attack. And that instinct formed, not by mathematics, but by understanding the logic of the adversary, was the final safeguard. The Americans didn't need to fire a missile. They didn't need to jam a signal. They didn't need to fake a launch. They just needed to exist, quietly, while the Soviet system watched its own reflection and called it war. In the heart of Moscow, the recording played on loop, inside a secure vault beneath the Ministry of Defense. Senior officers and security officials gathered around a playback terminal. On the screen, surveillance footage from the command center at Serpukhov 15. No explosions, no sirens, just a man staring at a blinking console. A screen showing launch detected. Another showing retaliation protocol standby, and then nothing. For nearly 8 minutes, Colonel Petrov sat still, silent, as the most advanced early warning system in Soviet history begged for escalation. He denied it, the only thing it needed human confirmation. To those watching, it was unbearable. The red phone went untouched. Subordinates shifted nervously. Protocol logs remained untriggered. The entire bunker existed for this moment, designed, drilled, reinforced for one scenario, respond instantly to an American strike. And the man in charge did not. The footage was humiliating, not because it showed failure, but because it showed survival by accident. The system had failed, and its savior was not policy, not code, not engineering. It was hesitation, doubt, human intuition. What the general saw in that recording was the death of their certainty. At 0048, the alarm cleared, no launch detected. The console returned to idle. The danger passed, not because of technology, but because a single man refused to believe it. Across the hall, a separate tape was playing a transcription of internal communications during the event. The launch control officers had been ready. Launch code packages were prepared. Mobile command units had gone on standby. Strategic rocket forces had activated preliminary targeting orders. It would have taken just one escalation from Petrov to initiate the next phase one level higher, and the missiles would have been readied. 2 more steps, and the world would have plunged into a nuclear exchange. The order had not been given, but every component of the machine had moved. Every part except the man at the center. And that fact humiliated the system, because it proved what Soviet planners never wanted to admit, that even the most disciplined structure, the most advanced warning system, the most mechanized doctrine, was still vulnerable to one variable instinct. Petrov didn't know he had saved the world. He didn't know that his silence was the only thing standing between full retaliation and a phantom threat. But the system knew, and it hated him for it. They had built a perfect machine, a multi-layered defense system spanning orbits, radars, and codebooks designed to remove hesitation, eliminate doubt, and compress response time down to minutes. Every switch, every satellite, every doctrine existed to make war automatic, and yet it all collapsed the moment a man refused to obey. The Soviet High Command had to confront the unspoken truth. Their system hadn't failed because of a technical fault. It had failed because of faith. Faith that the machine would always be right. Faith that a signal meant a missile. That data was reality. That automation would save them from indecision. But what they faced on September 26, 1983, was not American aggression. It was their own reflection, amplified by algorithms and untested belief. The ideological failure ran deeper than technology. First, it exposed that centralized control was a myth, in theory. Launch on warning meant total confidence in the system. In practice, it required trust in the one man monitoring it. Petrov's decision didn't just prevent catastrophe. It revealed that ultimate power rested with a single human being, in a single chair, at a single moment. That fragility horrified the system architects. Second, it revealed that speed was not safety. The doctrine that faster response meant stronger deterrence had backfired. By compressing the timeline to minutes, the Soviets had removed all space for analysis, diplomacy, or verification. They had built a race against themselves and nearly lost. Third, it showed that automation required infallibility, but their machines were blind to nuance. The satellite didn't lie. It simply didn't understand. It read sunlight as heat, clouds as launches, and the entire command structure accepted its voice without question until one man decided to listen to silence instead. Fourth, it proved that ideology can't override physics. No amount of political certainty or doctrinal rigidity could change the fact that light, under rare conditions, could fool sensors designed to detect fire. No amount of revolutionary loyalty could override a misinterpretation of reflected heat. Finally, it broke the myth of strategic omniscience. For decades, Soviet generals believed their systems would see everything, that the Americans could not surprise them. But that night, it wasn't the Americans who were invisible, it was themselves. The enemy wasn't a U.S. missile. It was a blind spot, a logic error, a human truth. In that moment, the Cold War wasn't about weapons or numbers. It was about trust, where to place it, who to give it to, and whether anyone deserved it. Petrov had trusted himself. The Soviet Union had trusted the system. Only one of them had been right. It sits behind glass now, in a museum in Moscow, deep inside a Cold War exhibit. There is a control panel, a relic of another world. It's unpowered, wires cut, warning lights faded. But the button is still there, the one that would have confirmed Armageddon. Next to it, a simple placard nuclear early warning console. 1983, no mention of the name. No inscription for the man who sat there. No tribute for what didn't happen. Stanislav Petrov lived quietly for decades after the incident. He was never awarded honors, never given a medal. For years, even his colleagues didn't know what he had done, or more accurately, what he had not done. He died in 2017 in near anonymity. But every September, veterans and historians remember the night the world almost ended, not because of aggression, but because of silence. Because a system designed to be perfect was stopped by a man trained to obey, who instead chose to think. He broke protocol. He broke the chain. And in doing so, he saved every life that would have vanished in a retaliatory spiral of thermonuclear fire. He didn't press the button, and that made all the difference. In the end, it was not satellites, codes, or missiles that preserved the world. It was a single human heartbeat that refused to surrender to the machine. The Cold War did not end in Berlin. It ended in a concrete bunker, with one man staring at a lie and refusing to believe it.